Hello, everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the film Twisters have a surprisingly strong opening weekend, coming in well over projections. Keep in mind that as we went into the weekend, the number $60 million domestic was being thrown around. Instead, the film ended up doing over $80 million domestically. A very, very strong start to this film, though it still has quite a ways to go, especially with the fact that the vast majority of its money is indeed coming from the domestic market. And while that is a good sign for its health down the road, in the domestic market specifically, it still does need to have some presence overseas if it's going to hope to get to the amount of money it needs to break even. Remember that this film cost $200 million before any of the tax credits, tax breaks that it would have gotten from Oklahoma City, as has been reported previously. But right now, that number is still being reported as being high as $155 million, even with breaks factored in, which is still quite a bit of money to make back. But right now, things are looking very, very good for this film to actually be able to hit its break even, and also to be, at this point, a surprise box office sleeper hit for this summer. I think that this is going to be something that people talk about for quite a while, of just how successful this film's opening weekend was over the projections. But as you all know, time will truly be the teller of this story, and the second weekend numbers especially will be even more significant, especially since its second weekend will go toe-to-toe with the grand opening of Deadpool and Wolverine, which is expected to gobble up especially that more adult audience that this film seems to be appealing to. And so the question remains, will it have a strong hold? Will it be able to actually perform as well as its opening weekend and as ahead of its initial projections have been? And also, what role will Deadpool Wolverine play, if any, in those second weekend numbers? And so we will talk about that and a plethora of other films. Before going any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, line up that fire button over on Odyssey, smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you are subscribed, hit that bell notification, that way you know every time a new video or live stream goes live on the channel. So as, of course, we are covering this, there's some crazy breaking news that Joe Biden has dropped out of the 2024 presidential race. And even though we don't cover politics specifically on this channel, I did think it was important just to mention that point, because literally as I'm recording this, it happened within the last half hour. So pretty crazy stuff going on, and of course being mentioned here on Deadline. And speaking of that, good old Nance over at Deadline is talking about how Twisters has swirled, oh, you love their puns, to $123 million global opening. Despicable Me 4 is now going towards $600 million worldwide. Now, as you all know, I'm still very much of the mind that I think we might have $3 billion films this year, possibly even upwards of $4 billion films. Depends really on how Moana 2 is received. And that won't be still for another month or two when that film eventually comes out. But I still also hold that Despicable Me 4 has a chance at $1 billion. Now, I definitely think that as the weeks go on and as this film continues to trudge along, that it's much more of a long shot. It is definitely not a guarantee. I just have this bit of a thought, because these Despicable Me movies tend to have very, very good runs down the line. The big question mark, I think, for that movie is going to be how well does it hold internationally, and also how much money does it make in the markets where it is either just released or is about to release, of which we might still be waiting on those numbers for. And will that ultimately be what brings it over that $1 billion mark or not? What I can say for sure, though, and I'm very confident about this, is that Deadpool Wolverine will absolutely be a $1 billion film this year. And I honestly think that Deadpool Wolverine, especially with the projections for its monster opening, and if the film's market, and if this market in film that we are seeing now with films like Twisters, for instance, coming in $20 million over the initial projections domestically, if that also happens, if they are able to, or they are unable to match exactly what they think is going to happen with Deadpool Wolverine, we could potentially see that film get upwards of $200 million in its domestic opening as a rated R film, which is absolutely insane, set to be the biggest domestic opening of 2024, and also potentially a record-setting film and record-setting numbers for any rated R film, which is still very, very impressive. Of course, we will break those numbers down when we get to that film, when we get the actual numbers for that film, and we'll do some fair comparisons using actual adjusting for inflation and ticket prices and things like that, because as you all know, Oftentimes when the mainstream media talks about these things, they typically leave those very important details out, and we like to cover them here on OMB Reviews. But hey, getting back to the fact at hand, Twisters is doing incredibly well at over $100 million in the global market, but still the vast majority of that coming from the domestic market. Let's go ahead and dive into those numbers here at thenumbers.com. As you can see, Twisters getting $80.5 million in its domestic opening, $19,000 per theater. Again, pretty crazy stuff going on. Remember that no one really was expecting anything from this movie going into it. There were obviously some early tracking numbers, especially from the likes of Box Office Theory, saying it could get upwards of into the mid-upper 70s, but I don't think anyone thought it would actually get to this specific point. Not to mention that, you also go to even the sites like Deadline, the mainstream sources, when they got those initial numbers, right, that the film had made around $10 million in its debut theatrically, people thought, okay, this seems to then be meaning the film's tracking towards a 60-plus million opening, right, between 60 and 70. No one thought, I think, that this was going to be seeing upwards of 80. So clearly its Saturday numbers were very, very impressive. They are expecting it to have a typical hold for a Sunday, and so that's why these estimates are what they are. Meaning, when we get those actual numbers on Monday or Tuesday of this week, we could see that number go up a little bit. We could see that number go down a little bit. No matter which way it lands, though, this film, a monster opening compared to, again, the initial estimates. Obviously, we can think of many bigger films, objectively, that have come out this year that have opened over $100 million domestic. But again, a sequel to a 1996 film getting $80.5 million in a year where there are so many box office flops. Yeah, not really what you expect. Why is this happening? Personally, I think that the marketing for the film was actually pretty effective. It came across as an inoffensive disaster movie, and it sounds, based off of the reviews that I've seen for it, that that's exactly what you get. You get an inoffensive disaster movie. The director coming out saying it's not pushing any type of political messaging. It's not talking about things like climate change or anything like that. I think probably also helped. As you all know, though, things like that, honestly, I don't think oftentimes make too much of a difference. It's all about what is the marketing doing? What is the word of mouth campaign on it? And though that can definitely help, saying, hey, guess what? This is an inoffensive movie that you'll probably find yourself mindlessly enjoying. Sounds like that is enough for most people these days. And sure enough, you look at the numbers here, and the numbers are pretty clear. Coming to the number 2 spot, as I've been talking about, Domestically 4 is continuing to have very, very strong holds. Even though it is now in its third week of release, dropping from 337 screens, it is still only dropping 45% in its third week. So still holding pretty strong. We can suspect that this and Inside Out 2 will continue to have numbers like this for the foreseeable future. As you can see, Inside Out 2, by probably tomorrow, if not Tuesday, will easily cross $600 million domestically. We can suspect right now that Despicable Me 4 will probably end somewhere between 300 and a max of 450 domestic. And again, that would be a pretty high number domestically for the film, but I do still think it has a lot of gas left in the tank to be able to get upwards of that, right? In that range of 300, obviously 300 at the minimum, 450 million. I think kind of as a maximum, probably more likely ending somewhere between 350 and 400 domestic if I had to take a guess. Still looking very, very strong, and obviously it could also hold even further than that down the line. As I mentioned, Despicable Me movies, the universe that has been built by Illumination, by Universal, tend to have pretty strong holds down the line, so we could potentially see that stuff happening, but obviously we're looking at it right now, and it's doing very well. Still has a long ways to go to get to $1 billion worldwide, but I think, again, the numbers are starting to become a little bit more clear about how that path is absolutely still on the table, though if it is going to be a film that gets there, it's either, as I've been saying now for a long time, going to just miss out on $1 billion or just barely cross $1 billion, okay? This is not going to be the comfortable $1 billion that you see for the likes of Inside Out 2 or what I suspect will happen with Deadpool and Wolverine, but hey, still looking good, and with the budget for the film especially, it doesn't really matter because it's already making some pretty good profits. Inside Out 2, speaking of profit, also continues to add to its overall profits. Making this much money both domestically and internationally is just good for Disney at the end of the day. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions in net profits after you take into account how much they spent, the marketing cost, and also the split between studios and theaters. It's looking very, very good for them. They're making up a lot of lost revenue from last year, but they're still a far way away at this point from being able to cross it. What is interesting, I think, is that with the release of Deadpool Wolverine, if the budget for that film ends up being around $100 million, which again, we don't have that official number as of the recording of this video, but if it is around that number, I think that if you get that movie getting to $1 billion worldwide as a rated R film especially, yeah, we're talking about them potentially getting $1 billion worth of profit just from those two movies alone. And that's even before you get to a film like Moana, which, though I do have, again, this sense that it has that chance of being a massive disappointment, I also still cannot deny the fact that Moana as a movie has a massive fan base, has a lot of people, especially mothers and their daughters, who would absolutely go to see that just because it is a Moana film. Obviously, I think quality will have an impact on it to some degree. And the fact that it's being adapted from a show, right? It was written and created to be a show, and they last minute decided to now convert the show that they had already made into a movie. That almost always has problems whenever you see that happen in the past. So I do suspect that could potentially impact it if they don't do it effectively. But again, I think that is also going to be another film to kind of look at in the future. And hey, good news for Disney. Doesn't make up for the years previous to last, but the fact that they might be able to wipe out the losses from last year is, I think, something that they are looking forward to. And we're just talking about the theatricals. Obviously, if you want to bring up the theme parks and things like that, okay. But just talking here theatrically, even if you're making billions of dollars in your theme parks, you still have to keep in mind that you want to make money in all of the different areas of your company. And if you're losing $1 billion in your films, it doesn't matter where you're making money elsewhere. That's just not a good thing. And it's also not sustainable long term. I think that this is a temporary reprieve for Disney as I, again, look ahead to next year's Marvel film, the first film they have next year in February being Captain Falcon. And I just don't think that film is going to really do it for them, especially with the massive, massive budget that movie has. We don't even have the final reporting on that yet. Even if it is somehow successful, wouldn't be able to likely make its money back, having to probably make $1 billion just to break even. And we, of course, will get to that next year when we get to that point. But just kind of giving you a little bit of a current update as far as net profits, net gains, and the potential for future gains and losses when it comes to the Walt Disney Company. Coming in the number 4 spot, actually holding much stronger than I anticipated, Longlegs from Neon, making another $11.7 million, actually added 340 screens. So obviously, Neon seeing some success with this. And I suspected it would be dropping probably 60% plus, because typically that happens with the horror or thriller films that come out of these more indie production companies. But clearly there must be enough interest in this movie. The reaction has been relatively mixed, which is why I'm actually surprised. Normally when you have a mixed or negative reaction, you tend to kind of get this massive drop off. But clearly there is enough intrigue being built, probably by the presence of Nicolas Cage, if I had to guess, that is leading more and more people that maybe missed out on its opening weekend to come back now and watch it in its second weekend. And so very interesting. The film has now already made a profit and is likely to make a pretty decent amount. I mean, we're talking about enough to not only pay for maybe 2 other films like Longlegs with a sub $10 million budget, but also all the marketing costs that would typically go along with that too. So again, very impressive there from Neon, and I think that they are going to be very happy with that number now, making $44 million domestically. Number 5 spot goes to Quiet Place Day 1, continuing to truck along as well, $6.1 million at this point. So obviously it's starting to leave around 500 screens a week, and so we can suspect that this film will probably still make a little bit every now and then throughout the rest of for the next few weeks. But as I mentioned, anything now at this point is just net profits for it, adding on to those totals. Same cannot be said about Fly Me to the Moon. So as I've mentioned previously, even though we live in the time where Twisters is, breaking its own projections by $20+ million, even though we're living in a time when Despicable Me 4, Inside Out 2 are massive hits for their respective studios, when we have films like Longlegs, right, surprising everybody at the box office, we also still have films like Fly Me to the Moon, a film from Sony and Apple that costs about $100 million projected, $100 million production budget, and has now only made $16.3 million in the domestic market, dropping 65% domestically in its second week. And this movie is right now guaranteed to lose probably north of $100 million by the end of its run. So yes, you still have, of course, films that are doing very well, films that are surprising. You also still have massive box office flops. So the theaters are not back to any degree, right? You're having success, obviously. I think this coming weekend with Deadpool Wolverine, you're going to have massive success, especially with those popcorn buckets, I imagine, which will go very, very quickly. But you still, at the same time, are dealing with that issue where you still have these other, films that in more strong years might actually have a stronger performance, might actually be able to drive out this probably being geared towards and ordered towards that older demographic that still really hasn't come back to the theater in any real tangible way for a lot of movies, right? I think we can think about Sound of Freedom being one of those rare exceptions, but that film definitely, appealed to vast demographics and not just one particular one. But still have box office flops here. Fly Me to the Moon is definitely going to be the biggest, if not one of the biggest box office flop. Furiosa right now is the biggest flop of the year, and I suspect will definitely be in the top 3 next year. Fly Me to the Moon, though, might actually have some contention there because of how much money will be lost on the film. Bad Boys Ride or Die continuing to add to its profits. Maxine from A24 continuing to drop off, dropping over 1,000 screens. This film's basically done making its money. Bike Rider's still hanging around. Unfortunately, though, this film just not making a whole lot of money. Won't be able to make its money back in the long run. Going to the individual releases, Twisters is now at $123 million worldwide. Again, very impressive. As you can see, a much more skewed domestic opening versus international. But remember, because you get a higher percentage back from the domestic versus international, this is a problem that ultimately the company behind Twisters is probably going to be pretty happy with, because they're getting a lot more money back from that initial opening. And I suspect we'll see some pretty good numbers down the road. Obviously, I do suspect that there's going to be some impact of Deadpool Wolverine, because I just think that's going to gobble up most of the theaters, most of the market next week. But remember, Deadpool and Wolverine is still going to be a rated R film. So you still have a demographic of the younger kids who I'm sure will try to sneak into that movie or have their parents bring them to it for whatever reason. But you also still have, I think, a lot that are either going to have to see a film like Twisters because it's PG-13, or, and here's the other thing that maybe people don't think about, or it'll be the movie that they buy the ticket to so they can then sneak into the rated R film. So that's why, again, don't count Twisters out in the long run at this point, but still massive opening weekend for it comparatively to its initial estimates, and it's looking in a decent position to actually be able to make its money back. We have to, of course, wait and see. Still has a long way to go. Despicable Me 4 at $574 million worldwide at the point of its release. Just to give you an idea, right? Let's go ahead and try to bring some comparisons up on the screen. We obviously love doing these things live, so I did not have this previous, but let's just, again, try to keep me honest here. Why do I think that there's a chance for this movie to still be able to break the number of $1 billion? Well, first off, let's go ahead and look at what we have going on domestically. So the entire run of Despicable Me 3 back in 2017, before you adjust for inflation, was $264 million. We're right now seeing that even when you adjust for inflation, as this actually does here on the screen. I don't know why it randomly uploaded there, but as you can see, $318 million is what the adjusted number is. I think right now you can look at this number and say, okay, we know now that this movie, Despicable Me 4, is going to be able to make more than Despicable Me 3's domestic, okay? The question mark is going to be where it ends up internationally. Right now, we're not seeing the same kinds of numbers. Obviously, the theatrical market, especially internationally, has not really, in any way become consistent with what we saw pre-pandemic, right? It's kind of been all over the place as we look at it. But still, I think that we're looking at a film where, in the case of Despicable Me 4 has a pretty good chance of getting closer to $400 million by the end of its run domestically, which means that if it only ends up getting to $500 million internationally, that brings it pretty close to $1 billion. And so the real question is going to be, okay, how far ahead is this movie actually tracking? The unadjusted numbers is 259 versus 188 at the same point of release. And so as you can see, right now this film is tracking, the newest film is tracking well ahead of where the Despicable Me 3 was. But let's go ahead and actually give like-for-like comparisons here domestically by adjusting for inflation in those daily reports, those daily numbers. And at the same point of release, what we can find here is that the movie, let's see, I don't know why it's acting in such a weird way right now. But as you can see, at the same point of release, when adjusted for inflation, $259 million is where this newest film, Despicable Me 4, is, versus it keeps on randomly doing this. What's going on here with the numbers.com? $226 million adjusted is where you find the numbers for Despicable Me 3. So we're talking about it having about a $30 million advantage, and it's only in the third week of release. And so I think that this advantage will not just continue, but obviously continue to build upon itself. You can see it dropped off quite a bit after that point. And yeah, right. That's why, again, I have a lot of suspicions that this movie 4 still has a lot of gas left in its tank by the end of its run. And Inside Out 2 right now is at $1.4 billion. And so let's just make sure that's the most up-to-date number. Yeah, I do suspect this film to be able to get to either 1.5, 1.6 billion by the end of its run. So yeah, doing very, very well. $1 billion from international alone is still on the table. Keep this in mind, okay? Because there are still countries where this film has not yet released, or we don't have numbers that have been reported for. The biggest one, of course, would be Japan. As you all know, Japan can be a bit of a wild card. Sometimes it can do very, very well. Sometimes it can be not as impressive. Usually with a delayed release, you don't tend to see, I think, as big numbers as you potentially could, because you have a market that is now a month or 2 months behind everyone else in the world. And so that could have an impact on motivations to go and see it, especially if it's going to be more readily available to get out on streaming or to get out on PVOD or whatever it might be. But still, Japan is a factor that has not yet been brought into the equation. And so I think that that's why $1 billion is still definitely a possibility for the international markets. You also, again, have a couple other countries where there's nothing in this chart, at least, that's been reported yet from the likes of smaller countries like Sweden or the Netherlands. But again, Japan, I think, is going to be potentially something that could push this film over the edge, which would make it not just $1 billion international film, but also, again, getting pretty close to that $1.6 billion mark. Longlegs is at $46 million worldwide. Again, obviously much more domestic focus for this movie. And A Quiet Place Day One, $241 million, still looking also very, very good. Obviously, it's still not anywhere close to where the previous films in the franchise were, but it's justifying its own existence and making decent profit to boot. Going to the chart, because we love charts here on OMB Reviews, we can see right now that Twisters still has a ways to go. Even with that $155 million production budget, it's still around $171 million that it still needs to make up, right? Now, keep in mind, right, this is not just meaning it needs to make $171 million more dollars. It means that it needs to make enough money to account for the split between the domestic, international theaters versus the studio returns, right? And so it's got to make well more than $171 million just to make its money back, because of how those splits ultimately end up working. This will indeed get a China release. We're still waiting on some of those first numbers from China to be brought in, but remember, it's a bit of fool's gold there because you get so little return back on your investment. But again, definitely a strong start for it, but it has, as I've said, a long ways to go. If we take into account what typical opening weekend numbers mean for the long run, usually we see about the opening weekend globally for a film that has a just, again, same day global release, usually is about 30% or about a third roughly of the entire box office by the end of its run. So if we were to put that into account in this case, we would say that, again, $400 million worldwide is on the table for the film. Now, that would be just barely above a 2.5 multiplier for its break even. But remember, we live in a world now where it's probably closer to 3 times the budget that a film typically needs to make its money back. It really depends on where it makes it. Since this film is making most of its money domestically, it's right now in a good place. But nothing is guaranteed yet at this point. There's still no guarantee the film will make its money back, but obviously much stronger start than anyone would have expected, and definitely in a good place to do well in the long run. We now have the week 2 numbers for Longlegs and also for Flight of the Moon, so we can make some projections here. So because of $46 million being reported for Longlegs, based off of historical standards, we can project the film will probably end its entire run with around $66 to $93 million in the global box office. That would be very, very impressive for this film, especially when no one was expecting much from it. A $10 million, less than $10 million production budget is what we've been told about it, the film so far. Whereas in the case of Fly Me to the Moon, because it's only made $30 million, it's going to make somewhere between $43 and $61 million by the end of its run. This one instead having a $100 million budget, which is definitely not a good thing. Because of these numbers, we can project in the case of Fly Me to the Moon, it's going to lose somewhere between 123 and 113. Remember, this is using the old metric, and so probably closer between 125 and $150 million in financial losses by the end of its run. Not a good thing for the studios involved in any means. Where on the flip side, you have Longlegs, which is projected to make somewhere between $25 and $41 million, and I would suspect between 25 and 50 in net profits is probably what's likely going to happen, because this film has been seeing much stronger than expected holds and just a much more impressive box office than anyone could have initially anticipated. So good for them. Also, as you can see right now, they're around 10.3 million in net gain at this point. After 2 weeks, this film has already made its money back, has already also made around 10 million in profit. It's already been able to pay for any future sub $10 million film they have down the road. By the end of its run, as I'd mentioned, it's going to not only be able to do that, but I think also to be able to pay for the marketing for that future film, and also probably be able to do that twice over, right? To have 2 films and 2 marketing budgets for a future project. As you can see in the case of Fly Me to the Moon, this film is now at 135 million in net losses. And as I'd mentioned previously, that is just, again, likely going to be where this film ends up in the long run, right? Probably between $100 and $150 million. And it's just, not looking good for that movie in any way. Movie 4 right now has made $116 million in net profits. So as you can see, even if the film doesn't get to $1 billion, still very impressive numbers nonetheless. So kudos to them for doing that. Sound of Hope is still not made its money back as of the recording of this video. And so obviously I'm sad to hear that. It's a very, very, very solid film that I hope everyone gets a chance to see. Just doesn't look like they are able to get that film marketed in the right way. Quiet Places are on $12 million in profits. Again, not going to be the biggest profit maker in the world, but definitely going in a very good direction. Horizon, as we've mentioned previously, a box office flop, but apparently it's being picked up by Netflix, and so that is going to definitely save this movie from falling into complete obscurity in any way. Bike Riders, of course, also financial loss there. Inside Out 2, as you can see, $360 million in net profits at this point. Very, very impressive numbers there. Probably going to end 400 to 500 million in net profits. And if Deadpool Wolverine is able to do something similar, it makes up about $1 billion worth of losses just from last year alone. Bad Boys Ride or Die at $32 million in profits. The Watchers at $28 million in losses. And Furiosa, still a massive financial loss. And those are the numbers currently as they stand. What are y'all's thoughts? Do you think Twisters has a chance to make its money back? I think based on the numbers, it's definitely a possibility. It's got a long way to go. It's got to have a very strong week 2 hold, but again, anything could happen. Also, do you think that Deadpool Wolverine is going to maybe mess up the plans that Twisters might have in its sights? And also thoughts on things like Longlegs, Fly Me to the Moon, and any of the other films that I've talked about. Let me know all those things in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button. Allow that fire button over on Aussie. Smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Check out the full article where I break these things down even further with more focus and also less time over on geeksandgamers.com, where I post articles every single week doing the box office breakdown over there. Check that out. Also, you guys are amazing, beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Sunday, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Patreon, Subscribe Star, Locals, and YouTube members who are at the Chosen of Valhalla level. Starting off with my Patreon supporters, Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, which is Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. To my Subscribe Star chosen members, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, and also the K-Man, check him out at xtheboundaries.co, and a shout out also to my one Chosen of Valhalla YouTube member, Mr. Roy. Thank you again for being so much of a huge supporter of the channel. And to every one of my chosen members, if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want access to things like giveaways of Blu-rays, 4Ks, etc., and access to an exclusive podcast bonus material for members, check out the links in the video description below for all of those details. You guys are amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed month of the Sacred Heart, and as always, God bless.